My daughter's wedding planner pulled me aside. The groom is after her inheritance. I smiled as he toasted with our family's rarest crystal. During the mother-daughter dance I whispered, "Let him laugh tonight, sweetheart. By sunrise he'll realize. Some absences are deliberate." The morning sun streamed through the cathedral windows, casting golden rays across empty pews that would soon fill with guests. I stood in the bridal suite doorway, watching my daughter Emma adjust her veil for the 100th time. Her hands trembled, not with excitement but with something else. Something I recognized from my own reflection 30 years ago when I married her father. "Mom, do you think Zach will make it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I forced a smile, the same practiced expression I'd perfected through decades of charity galas and business dinners. "Sweetheart, you know your brother. He'll be here when it matters." But even as the words left my lips, I knew they weren't true. Zach's chair would remain empty today and every guest would notice. They always did when something was missing from a picture that should have been perfect. Before we continue, I want to thank you for joining me. If you believe in the power of protective love and family bonds, please subscribe. It's free and helps us reach more people who need these stories. The empty seat that no one dared to ask about became the elephant in the room before the ceremony even began. I watched as guests filtered in, their eyes inevitably drawn to the front row where Zach should have been sitting. Aunt Margaret leaned over to whisper something to my sister-in-law, their heads bobbing in that conspiratorial way that made my teeth clench. Cousin Robert kept glancing at the vacant chair like it might suddenly produce my son. When Daniel's groomsman asked about it, he just shrugged with that easy charm of his. "You know how it is with corporate travel," he said, adjusting his boutonniere. "Zach's probably closing some deal in Tokyo right now." The lie rolled off his tongue so smoothly that I almost believed it myself. Almost. But I knew better. I knew exactly where my son was, and more importantly, I knew why he wasn't here. Daniel was charming. Devastatingly so. The kind of charming that made waitresses blush and elderly ladies pat his arm approvingly. But I'd spent 45 years reading people, first in boardrooms, then at PTA meetings, and finally across dinner tables where million-dollar deals were disguised as casual conversation. His charm felt manufactured, like cologne sprayed too heavily to cover something unpleasant underneath. During the ceremony, I watched him work the crowd with his eyes even while promising to love my daughter forever. He winked at her college roommate during the vows. He nodded approvingly at my business partner when the minister mentioned financial security. When he slipped the ring onto Emma's finger, I swear I saw him glance at her tennis bracelet, the one that had belonged to my grandmother, with the same look a jeweler gives when appraising merchandise. "You may kiss the bride," the minister announced, and Daniel did, with just enough passion to make the crowd sigh appreciatively. But his hand, I noticed, lingered on the pearl necklace at Emma's throat. The one worth more than most people's cars. The rehearsal dinner the night before had been my first real glimpse behind his mask. We'd reserved the private dining room at the country club, complete with crystal chandeliers and enough flowers to stock a botanical garden. Emma had insisted on perfection and I'd given it to her, even though each detail felt like another nail in a coffin I couldn't yet name. Daniel held court at the head table, regaling everyone with stories about his consulting work, his travels, his ambitious plans for the future. "Emma's going to make the perfect wife," he announced, raising his glass of our finest champagne. "She's got such a generous heart. Sometimes too generous, if you know what I mean." The table laughed politely, but I felt ice form in my chest. Emma's cheeks flushed pink and she laughed along, but it was the kind of laugh you make when you're trying to convince yourself something isn't wrong. "She's always been the emotional one in the family," Daniel continued, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "Good thing she's got me to keep her grounded, right?" I watched my daughter's smile falter for just a moment before she fixed it back in place. 26 years of being her mother, and I could read every micro-expression that crossed her face. That wasn't happiness. That was resignation wrapped in Vera Wang's silk. My fingers tightened around my wine glass until I worried it might shatter. Around the table, family members nodded and chuckled, oblivious to the subtle cruelty in his words. But I heard it. The way he diminished her while pretending to praise her. The way he positioned himself as her savior rather than her partner. The wedding planner, Margaret Chin, had been coordinating society events for 15 years. I'd worked with her on 3 charity galas, and she had an impeccable reputation for discretion. which is why her approach before the ceremony shocked me to my core. She appeared at my elbow as I stood near the altar, checking that the flower arrangements were positioned correctly. Her usually professional demeanor had cracked, revealing something almost frantic underneath. "Mrs. Wellington," she whispered, glancing around to ensure we weren't overheard. "I need to tell you something and I hope you'll forgive me for overstepping." My heart began to race, though I kept my expression neutral. "What is it, Margaret?" She leaned closer, her voice barely audible above the organ music. "It's about Daniel. I've been in this business long enough to recognize certain patterns. The questions he's been asking about your family's assets, the way he's been researching property values in your neighborhood. Ma'am, I don't think he's marrying Emma for love." The words hit me like a physical blow, even though some part of me had been expecting them. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying he's marrying for the inheritance," she said quickly, her eyes darting toward the bridal suite where Emma was making final preparations. "I've seen it before. The charm, the rushed timeline, the way he talks about securing their future. I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but..." She trailed off, shaking her head. I stood there for a moment, feeling the cathedral walls close in around me. The morning sun suddenly felt cold against my skin, and the scent of lilies became overwhelming. "Thank you," I managed to say, my voice steadier than I felt. "For telling me." Margaret nodded quickly and disappeared into the crowd of vendors and family members, leaving me alone with the truth I'd been trying to avoid for months. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't march into the bridal suite and demand that Emma call off the wedding. Instead, I did what I'd always done when faced with impossible situations. I smiled, straightened my shoulders, and walked back to my seat in the front row, right next to that empty chair that suddenly felt like an omen. The mother-daughter dance came near the end of the reception, after Daniel had charmed every guest, kissed every grandmother, and posed for what felt like thousands of photographs. The band struck up "The Way You Look Tonight," the same song I'd danced to at my own wedding, and Emma floated into my arms like she was still my little girl, asking me to twirl her around the living room. For a moment, surrounded by the soft glow of candlelight and the gentle murmur of our guests, I almost forgot about Margaret's warning. Almost forgot about the calculated way Daniel's eyes tracked every piece of jewelry, every family heirloom on display. Almost forgot about Zach's empty chair and all the reasons behind it. But as we swayed together, I felt the weight of motherhood settle on my shoulders like a familiar coat. The responsibility to protect my daughter even from herself. Even from choices she'd already made. I pulled her closer, close enough that my lips brushed her ear as we turned. "Let him laugh tonight, sweetheart," I whispered, the words coming from some deep, protective place I didn't even know existed. "By sunrise he'll realize. Some absences are deliberate." Emma pulled back slightly, confusion clouding her eyes. "Mom? What do you mean?" But I just smiled and continued dancing, letting the music carry us through the rest of the song. She wasn't ready for the truth yet. Neither was Daniel, sitting at the head table watching us with that proprietary smile of his. The evening air felt different as guests began to leave, couples walking hand in hand to their cars while Daniel posed for final photographs. I stood on the terrace watching my new son-in-law work the crowd, and I thought about absence. About the things we choose not to say, the people we choose not to invite, the truths we choose not to reveal. Zach's empty chair had spoken louder than any speech tonight. And tomorrow, Daniel would finally understand what that silence had been trying to tell him. The call came on a Tuesday evening in March, just as I was settling into my leather armchair with a cup of chamomile tea and the quarterly financial reports. The house felt cavernous without Emma's laughter echoing through the halls. She'd moved in with Daniel 3 months prior, claiming they needed to test-drive domestic life before the wedding. My phone buzzed against the mahogany side table. Zach's name appeared on the screen, which struck me as odd. My son rarely called during weeknights, preferring to save our conversations for Sunday morning coffee when he could give me his full attention. "Mom, I need you to sit down." His voice came through the speaker, steady but strained in a way that made my chest tighten. I was already seated, but something in his tone made me set down my teacup with deliberate care. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" "I've been helping Emma organize some of her old files from college. You know how she keeps everything in those banker's boxes in the garage?" His words came slowly, like he was choosing each one with surgical precision. "I found something. Actually, someone found me." The silence stretched between us, filled with the weight of unspoken dread. Zach had inherited my methodical nature, never one to dramatize or exaggerate. If he was calling with this kind of gravity, something was genuinely wrong. There's an email thread, Mom. Between Daniel and... He paused and I heard him take a shaky breath. Between Daniel and Lila. The name hit me like ice water. Lila Martinez, Emma's college roommate, maid of honor at her graduation party, the girl who'd spent countless holidays at our dinner table. The same Lila who'd vanished from Emma's life 2 years ago without explanation, leaving my daughter confused and heartbroken over the sudden loss of her closest friendship. Lila. I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. But she and Emma haven't spoken since. Since she started dating Daniel, Zach finished. Mom, these emails, they're not old. They're current. And they're not friendly. My hands found the arms of my chair, gripping the worn leather as the room seemed to tilt around me. What kind of emails? The kind that prove Emma was never his first choice. Zach had always been thorough, a trait that served him well in his forensic accounting career. What he'd discovered in those next few hours of digital archaeology painted a picture so devastating that I found myself grateful Emma wasn't there to witness my reaction. The email thread stretched back 14 months, beginning just 2 weeks after Daniel and Emma's first date. The messages started innocuously enough, Daniel reaching out to apologize for how things ended between him and Lila. But they quickly evolved into something far more sinister. I need more time, read one message from Daniel, dated 3 months into his relationship with Emma. The trust fund situation is more complicated than I thought. She's not as naive as she appears. Lila's response had been devastating in its clarity. You promised me 6 months, Daniel. I can't keep pretending I don't exist while you play house with my best friend. But perhaps the most damning evidence came in the form of a spreadsheet attachment. A detailed financial analysis of my family's assets that Daniel had compiled with the precision of a forensic auditor. Property values, investment portfolios, the estimated worth of family heirlooms. Everything itemized and calculated down to the last dollar. He wasn't just dating her, Mom, Zach explained, his voice tight with controlled anger. He was conducting a financial audit disguised as a romance. The hotel receipts told their own story. Every business trip Daniel claimed to take, every weekend conference that kept him away from Emma, had been spent in hotel rooms across the city with Lila. The dates aligned perfectly with Daniel's absences, creating a timeline of deception that left me breathless. Most revealing was a cancelled jewelry appraisal from Tiffany & Company, dated just 1 week before Daniel proposed to Emma. The appointment had been for an engagement ring, but not the one currently sitting on my daughter's finger. This ring was being appraised for resale value, suggesting Daniel had originally purchased it for someone else entirely. When Zach reached out to Lila, her response had been immediate and devastating. She agreed to meet him at a small cafe downtown, away from any chance encounters with mutual acquaintances. Zach described her as a shadow of the vibrant girl I remembered, hollow-eyed and brittle, like someone carrying a secret too heavy for her frame. He told me Emma was just a rebound, Lila had confessed through tears. That he needed time to process our relationship but that she meant nothing. He said she was too sheltered, too dependent on her family's money to ever be truly independent. The cruelest revelation was that Lila had learned about the engagement the same way everyone else had, through Emma's social media announcement. No warning, no explanation, just the sudden, devastating realization that the man she'd been secretly seeing for over a year was marrying her former best friend. I wanted to call Emma so many times, Lila had told Zach. But what could I say? That I'd been sleeping with her fiancé? That everything she thought she knew about their relationship was a lie. But it was the unopened envelope that Zach found tucked between the printed emails that revealed Daniel's true intentions. Addressed to Lila in Daniel's distinctive handwriting, it contained a plane ticket to Barcelona and a hotel reservation, both dated for the day after the wedding. Inside the envelope was a handwritten note. Once I have access to the trust, we can disappear together. Emma will be devastated, but she'll recover. He always does. Pack light, we won't be coming back. The note was dated 2 weeks before Daniel's proposal, revealing a level of premeditation that made my stomach churn. This wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of weakness. It was a calculated heist disguised as a love story. Zach's voice broke as he read the note aloud over the phone. Mom, he's planning to take everything and run. The wedding isn't the ending, it's just the beginning of the real theft. I sat in my chair long after Zach finished talking, staring at the family photographs arranged on the mantelpiece. Emma's graduation picture smiled back at me, her arm linked with Lila's, both girls beaming with the confidence of young women who believed the world was full of endless possibilities. What do we do? I finally asked, though part of me already knew the answer. We don't tell her, Zach said firmly. Not yet. If we confront him now, he'll just disappear and we'll never be able to prove anything. But if we let him think he's won, we can catch him in the act, I finished. Exactly. But Mom, we need to move fast. The wedding is in 6 months, and once he has legal access to Emma's assets, he'll be gone before she realizes what happened. That night I didn't sleep. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad, mapping out a strategy that would protect my daughter while ensuring Daniel faced the consequences of his deception. The moon cast long shadows across the pages as I worked, and with each line I wrote, I felt the familiar surge of protective fury that had carried me through Emma's childhood's scraped knees and teenage heartbreaks. But this was different. This wasn't a playground bully or a thoughtless teenage boy. This was a predator who had studied my family like a business acquisition, who had weaponized my daughter's capacity for love against her. By morning I had a plan. And by evening Zach and I had begun to implement it. The game had begun, but Daniel didn't know he was no longer the only player at the table. The next morning I called Richard Pemberton before my coffee had even finished brewing. Richard had been handling our family's legal affairs for 23 years, ever since my husband's passing, and I trusted him with secrets that could topple governments, or in this case, destroy a carefully constructed fraud. Margaret, it's barely 7 a.m., Richard's gravelly voice answered on the second ring. This must be serious. Richard, I need an emergency appointment. Today. And I need complete discretion. There was a pause, then the sound of papers rustling. How emergency are we talking? Scale of 1 to 10. 11. 2 hours later, I sat across from Richard's mahogany desk in his downtown office, watching his expression grow increasingly grim as I laid out everything Zach had discovered. The emails, the hotel receipts, the plane tickets. Each piece of evidence landed on his desk like a chess piece being positioned for checkmate. Good Lord, Margaret, he muttered, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. This isn't just fraud. It's systematic deception with clear intent to commit theft. Can we stop it legally? Richard leaned back in his leather chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. We can do better than stop it. We can create a trap so legally sound that even the best defense attorney couldn't find a crack. The first move was restructuring Emma's trust fund. What Daniel didn't know, what Emma herself didn't fully understand, was that her inheritance wasn't automatically accessible upon marriage. The original trust had been designed with protective clauses, but they weren't nearly robust enough to handle someone as calculating as Daniel. We're adding a 5-year marriage requirement, Richard explained as he pulled up the trust documents on his computer. No access to principal or significant distributions unless the marriage remains intact for a full 5 years. Any attempt to divorce or separate during that period triggers an automatic review of the beneficiary's intentions. I watched him type the new clauses, each word a nail in Daniel's coffin. What if he contests it? He can't contest what he doesn't know exists, Richard smiled grimly. This amendment is retroactive to last month, well before any engagement announcements. As far as the law is concerned, these protections were always in place. While Richard worked on the trust modifications, I reached out to Jennifer Walsh, our estate planning attorney. If Richard was a scalpel, Jennifer was a sledgehammer. Precise when needed, devastating when required. Margaret, darling, Jennifer's voice was warm but professional. Richard briefed me on the situation. I have to say, this is the most elaborate con I've encountered in 15 years of practice. Can you help us? Help you? Sweetheart, I'm going to gift wrap this man's downfall. The estate modification was elegant in its simplicity. Jennifer drafted an addendum to our family will that would automatically exclude any beneficiary who entered marriage under false pretenses. The language was carefully crafted to be ironclad yet invisible, buried in subsection 12 of a 30-page document that most people would never read completely. Any beneficiary who misrepresents their intent to marry for financial gain shall forfeit all claims to inheritance, gifts, or family assets. Jennifer read aloud as she finalized the document. It's beautiful, really. Completely legal, impossible to challenge, and retroactively applied to any marriages occurring within 12 months of this filing. But the most crucial element was the evidence gathering. Zach had become our secret weapon, using his forensic accounting skills to build an unshakable case. Every evening after work he would arrive at my house with new discoveries, each more damning than the last. "Lila's been incredibly helpful," he reported during one of our clandestine meetings. "She saved everything." Voice messages where Daniel explicitly talks about Emma's family money. Text conversations where he jokes about playing the long game. Even photos of documents he showed her, including a handwritten list of our family assets that he compiled while supposedly helping Emma organize her closet. The voice recordings were particularly devastating. In one message recorded just 3 weeks before the proposal, Daniel's voice dripped with calculated charm. "Baby, I know this is hard, but think about what we'll have once I secure the trust fund. We're talking generational wealth here. Emma's nice enough, but she's just a means to an end." Lila had also provided something even more valuable. Daniel's calendar entries from his phone, which he'd shared with her during their relationship. The entries revealed a disturbing pattern of strategic planning. "Coffee with ease mom, charm offensive," read one entry. Another noted, "research family charity connections, potential networking opportunities." But perhaps most chilling was an entry from 2 months ago. "Convince E to add me to investment accounts. Marriage equals full access." He's been documenting his own crime, Zach marveled as he showed me the screenshots. "It's like he wanted to get caught." "Arrogance," I replied simply. "He thinks he's smarter than everyone else." The next phase required delicate timing. We needed to ensure Emma remained unaware of our activities while simultaneously protecting her from Daniel's manipulation. This meant maintaining normal family interactions while secretly dismantling his entire plan. I began subtly questioning Emma about their financial discussions during our weekly lunch dates. "Have you and Daniel talked about combining your accounts after the wedding?" I asked casually over Caesar salads at her favorite bistro. Emma's face brightened. "Actually, yes. He's been so sweet about it. He said he wants to handle all the complicated financial stuff so I don't have to worry about it." "Isn't that thoughtful?" My heart clenched, but I kept my expression neutral. "Very thoughtful. What kind of arrangement are you considering?" He suggested adding him to my investment accounts right after the honeymoon. Something about streamlining our financial planning. She paused, twirling pasta around her fork. "He even offered to take over managing the trust fund distributions. Said I shouldn't burden myself with all those complicated documents." Every word confirmed our worst fears. Daniel wasn't just planning to access Emma's money. He was systematically positioning himself to control every aspect of her financial life. Meanwhile, Zach had enlisted Lila's help in gathering even more evidence. She agreed to meet Daniel one final time, wearing a recording device provided by Richard's private investigator. The conversation that resulted was so incriminating that even I was shocked by Daniel's callousness. "Once we're married, I'll have legal access to everything," Daniel's recorded voice explained to Lila. "The trust fund, the investment accounts, even her grandmother's jewelry collection. We just need to be patient for a few more months." "What about Emma?" Lila had asked. "Don't you feel guilty at all?" Daniel's laugh was cold and mechanical. "Guilty? She's getting what she wants. A wedding, a husband, the whole fairy tale. She'll survive the heartbreak. Rich girls always do." The recording device had captured every word with crystal clarity, providing us with evidence that would hold up in any court of law. As the wedding date approached, I found myself living a strange double life. During the day, I was the supportive mother of the bride, attending dress fittings and cake tastings with genuine enthusiasm for Emma's happiness. But in the evenings, I was a general planning a war, coordinating with attorneys and investigators to ensure Daniel's scheme would collapse the moment he tried to execute it. The most difficult part was watching Emma's excitement grow daily while knowing the truth about the man she was preparing to marry. She would call me with updates about their honeymoon plans, their apartment hunting, their dreams for the future. All built on foundations that would crumble within hours of saying "I do." But every time I was tempted to tell her everything, I remembered Richard's warning. If we tip our hand too early, Daniel will disappear. Better to let him hang himself with his own rope. 3 weeks before the wedding, we filed all the documents. The trust modifications, the estate amendments, the evidence packages. Everything was legally secured and time-stamped. Daniel's trap was set, baited with the very greed that had driven him to target my daughter in the first place. That night, I stood on my terrace overlooking the garden where Emma would soon exchange vows with a man who saw her as nothing more than a financial opportunity. The irony wasn't lost on me. We were allowing the wedding to proceed precisely because we wanted to protect her. Sometimes love means watching someone walk into danger, knowing you've already cleared the path behind them. The wedding reception unfolded like a perfectly choreographed performance, each moment timed to create maximum emotional impact. As guests settled into their seats for dinner, Daniel stood at the head table, commanding attention with the natural confidence of someone who believed he'd already won the ultimate prize. The crystal champagne flute in his hand caught the light from the crystal chandeliers above, our family's baccarat stemware, reserved for only the most significant celebrations. Each piece was worth more than most people's monthly salary, and Daniel held his like a trophy he'd earned rather than a privilege he'd been granted. Ladies and gentlemen, his voice carried across the ballroom without need for amplification. The conversations died down, replaced by the expectant silence of guests preparing to witness what they assumed would be a heartfelt declaration of love. I watched from my position at the family table, my own champagne untouched, as Daniel's smile widened. There was something predatory in his expression, the look of a hunter who'd successfully cornered his prey. When I first met Emma, he began, his free hand finding her shoulder possessively, I knew I'd found something rare. Something precious that needed proper care and guidance. The words made my stomach turn. Even in his wedding toast, he couldn't help but position himself as Emma's superior, her protector, her guide. Around me, guests smiled benevolently, hearing romance where I heard condescension. To forever, Daniel raised his glass higher, the crystal singing a pure note as it caught the light. To building something beautiful together. To securing our future. The word, securing, hit me like a physical blow. Even now, surrounded by our family and friends, he couldn't resist a subtle reference to his true motivation. Cameras flashed like lightning as he leaned down to kiss Emma's cheek, his lips lingering just long enough to make the photographers happy. I lifted my own glass with trembling fingers, the smile I'd perfected over decades of society functions firmly in place. Around me, guests applauded and cheered, completely unaware that they were celebrating the beginning of an elaborate theft. But as Daniel basked in the applause, his eyes swept the room with the calculating gaze I'd learned to recognize. He was counting guests, mentally cataloging influential faces, already planning how to leverage these connections for future opportunities. Zach's empty chair at our family table seemed to grow more prominent as the evening progressed. It sat like a question mark in the midst of celebration, drawing curious glances and whispered speculations from guests who knew our family well enough to notice the absence. Mrs. Henderson from the country club leaned over during the second course. Margaret dear, where's Zach this evening? I was so looking forward to seeing him. Business travel, I replied smoothly, the lie now rehearsed to perfection. You know how demanding his work can be. But Daniel's explanation to his groomsmen had been different, more revealing of his character. I'd overheard him near the bar, gesturing dismissively toward the empty chair. Zach's got some issues with commitment, he'd said with a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. Probably couldn't handle seeing his sister actually follow through with something important. The casual cruelty of the comment took my breath away. Here was my son who'd spent months protecting his sister from a predator, being dismissed as unreliable by the very man whose crimes he'd uncovered. As the evening wore on, Daniel's behavior became increasingly revealing to those who knew how to look. During the dinner service, I watched him charm the elderly widows at table 6, paying particular attention to Mrs. Ashford, whose late husband had left her a considerable art collection. You absolutely must show me your Monet sometime, Daniel was saying, his hand placed respectfully on her arm. I've been studying Impressionist investments lately. Fascinating market. Mrs. Ashford beamed under his attention, completely missing the way his eyes assessed her diamond tennis bracelet while he spoke about art appreciation. Later, while Emma freshened her makeup, I witnessed Daniel's conversation with my business partner's son, a recent Harvard MBA who managed several hedge funds. The Wellington family has such interesting investment strategies, Daniel mentioned casually. Emma's grandmother was particularly savvy with her portfolio choices. I'd love to learn more about the family's approach to wealth preservation. Each conversation was carefully orchestrated, each question designed to gather intelligence about our financial landscape. Daniel wasn't just celebrating his wedding, he was conducting reconnaissance for his future heist. But perhaps most disturbing was overhearing his phone call during a brief break between courses. He'd stepped onto the terrace, thinking himself alone, when his voice drifted through the French doors. "Everything's going perfectly," he said quietly into his phone. "The trust fund transfer should be accessible within the week. Yes, I have the account numbers." No, she suspects nothing. I pressed myself against the wall inside the ballroom, my heart pounding as I realized he was likely speaking to Lila, confirming their escape plans even as he celebrated his marriage to my daughter. When the band announced the mother-daughter dance, I felt the weight of the moment settle on my shoulders like a velvet cloak. This would be my last chance to prepare Emma for what was coming. Not the details, which would have been too devastating, but the emotional foundation she'd need to survive it. As "The Way You Look Tonight" began to play, Emma floated into my arms like she had as a little girl, back when her biggest problems could be solved with band-aids and bedtime stories. "You look radiant tonight, sweetheart," I whispered, meaning every word. Despite everything I knew about Daniel, despite the elaborate trap we'd set, Emma genuinely glowed with happiness. "I feel like I'm dreaming," she whispered back, her eyes bright with unshed tears of joy. We swayed together in comfortable silence for several measures before I felt compelled to plant the seed that might help her understand what was coming. "Emma," I said softly, pulling her closer so my words would reach only her ears. "No matter what happens in the coming days, remember that sometimes the people who love us most have to make difficult choices to protect us." She pulled back slightly, confusion clouding her features. "Mom, what do you mean?" "Just remember that love sometimes looks like letting go," I continued, my voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm me. "And sometimes, sweetheart, the absence of someone we expect to be there is the greatest gift they can give us." Emma's brow furrowed, but before she could ask more questions, the song was ending and Daniel was approaching to claim his dance with his new bride. As I returned to my seat, I caught Daniel watching me with narrowed eyes. For just a moment, his charming mask slipped, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. He'd heard something in my tone, sensed some undercurrent he couldn't quite identify. But then Emma was in his arms, and his practiced smile returned as cameras captured their first dance as husband and wife. He spun her gracefully, dipped her dramatically for the photographers, and whispered something in her ear that made her laugh. I sat at the family table, fingering the stem of my crystal champagne flute, and watched the man who thought he'd just secured his fortune dance with my daughter. Tomorrow he would discover that some victories are hollow, that some prizes come with prices he'd never anticipated paying. The empty chair beside me seemed to pulse with invisible energy, a reminder that the most important battles are often fought by those who choose to remain unseen. As the last dance ended and guests began filtering toward the exit, Daniel caught my eye across the dance floor. He raised his crystal flute one final time in my direction, a gesture I recognized as both gratitude and triumph. I smiled and raised my own glass in return, knowing it would be the last toast we'd ever share. The first rays of dawn filtered through the curtains of the honeymoon suite at the Grand Marquis Hotel, casting golden streaks across rumpled Egyptian cotton sheets. Daniel stirred slowly, his arm reaching across the king-sized bed for the warmth of his new bride, only to find cold, empty space where Emma should have been. His eyes snapped open, immediately scanning the opulent room that had cost more per night than most people earned in a month. The silence was deafening. No shower running, no soft humming from the bathroom, no gentle rustling of silk pajamas that he'd grown accustomed to during their cohabitation. "Emma." His voice cracked slightly, still rough with sleep and champagne from the night before. "Nothing." Daniel sat up abruptly, his head spinning from the sudden movement and the remnants of celebration. The suite looked exactly as they'd left it the night before, champagne bottle chilling in its silver bucket, rose petals scattered across the marble floor, wedding dress hanging pristinely in the armoire like a white ghost. But Emma's overnight bag was gone. Her jewelry case, the one that contained her grandmother's pearl earrings and the sapphire bracelet he'd specifically suggested she bring, had vanished from the vanity table. Even her phone charger had been removed from the bedside table. The only trace of her presence was a single sheet of hotel stationery, folded precisely in half and placed on her pillow. Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he reached for it, some primal instinct already warning him that whatever was written there would change everything. The note was written in Emma's careful script, each letter formed with the precision she'd learned in those expensive private schools. Check your inbox. 3 words. 21 letters. The complete destruction of his carefully orchestrated plan. Daniel's laptop sat closed on the mahogany desk across the room, suddenly looking like a ticking bomb rather than the tool he'd used to research and catalog the Wellington family's assets. He approached it with the reluctance of a man walking to his own execution. The email notification showed 47 unread messages, but only one sender mattered. emma.wellington.daniel@gmail.com. The timestamp read 5:47 a.m., less than 6 hours after their last dance, while he'd been sleeping off the champagne and dreaming of Barcelona beaches. The subject line was devastatingly simple: everything I know. Daniel's finger hovered over the trackpad for several heartbeats before he found the courage to open what he somehow knew would be his professional and personal obituary. The email began without preamble or emotion, just cold, factual presentation of evidence that made his blood turn to ice water. Daniel. Attached you will find screenshots of every email you sent to Lila Martinez during our relationship. Voice recordings of your conversations about my family's financial opportunities. Copies of hotel receipts for nights you claimed to be traveling for work. The prenuptial agreement you drafted before proposing. And the plane tickets to Barcelona dated for today. Tickets purchased in both your name and Lila's. My brother found everything 6 months ago. We've been waiting. Daniel's vision blurred as he scrolled through attachment after attachment. Screenshots of messages he'd thought were private, recorded phone calls where his voice dripped with calculated greed, even photos of handwritten notes where he'd calculated the estimated value of various family heirlooms. But the final attachment was what destroyed him completely. A forwarded message from Lila Martinez, sent to Emma just hours earlier. Emma, I can't let this happen anymore. He told me you were just a means to an end, that once he had access to your trust fund, we would disappear together. I was weak and lonely and believed his lies about loving me. He played us both and I can't live with myself if I don't tell you the truth. I'm sorry for everything. Lila. Daniel stared at the screen, watching his future evaporate in real time. His phone buzzed with incoming notifications, text messages, missed calls, voicemails piling up as the reality of his situation began to cascade through his carefully constructed network. He grabbed his phone with shaking hands, scrolling through message after message of cancellations and reversals that felt like watching dominoes fall in slow motion. His travel agent. Mr. Harrison, your flights to Barcelona have been cancelled at the request of your credit card company. Please contact us immediately. His bank. Account number 4472 has been temporarily frozen pending investigation of suspicious activity. Please visit our fraud department immediately. The hotel concierge. Sir, we've been instructed to hold all charges to your account pending resolution of a legal matter. Your corporate rate has been revoked. Even his attorney had sent a terse message. Daniel, I've received some disturbing information about your recent activities. We need to meet immediately. Do not contact Emma Wellington or her family. The walls of the luxury suite seemed to close in around him as the magnitude of his situation became clear. Everything he'd planned, every move he'd calculated, every lie he'd carefully constructed had been anticipated and countered by people he'd underestimated completely. His phone rang, the name Mom Wellington, appearing on the screen like a death sentence. Daniel stared at it for several rings before desperation overcame his fear. Why? The word escaped his lips before he could stop it, raw and broken and nothing like the confident charm he'd wielded so effectively for months. Margaret Wellington's voice came through the speaker like winter wind, cold, cutting, final. There was a long pause, as if she were savoring the moment of his destruction. You toasted to forever last night, she said finally, her words measured and deliberate. But you forgot something important, Daniel. Some toasts end with broken glass. The line went dead, leaving him alone with the silence that felt heavier than any sound he'd ever heard. Minutes later, his laptop chimed with one final message. This one came from an email address he'd never seen before: zachary.wellington.private@gmail.com. The message contained only a single sentence, but it cut deeper than Emma's evidence or Margaret's cold dismissal. You'll remember that empty chair forever. Because it was empty and still more useful than you. Daniel collapsed into the velvet armchair beside the window, staring out at the city skyline that had looked so promising just hours earlier. Somewhere out there, Emma was safe with her family, probably being comforted by the brother whose absence had seemed like such a minor detail the night before. The empty chair. The missing piece that he'd dismissed as unimportant, never realizing it represented the very person who'd been documenting his every move, building the case that would destroy him. As the morning sun climbed higher, Daniel sat in his empty suite, surrounded by the remnants of a celebration that had actually been his funeral. The champagne had gone flat, the roses were wilting, and the future he'd so carefully planned had crumbled to dust while he slept. The silence stretched endlessly before him, broken only by the distant sound of traffic and the steady buzz of his phone, call after call from numbers he didn't recognize, probably reporters or investigators or angry family members who'd just learned the truth. He didn't answer any of them. What was the point? The game was over and he'd lost more completely than he'd ever imagined possible. The empty chair had won. 3 weeks after the wedding that wasn't really a wedding, Emma appeared at my kitchen door holding nothing but her car keys and a small overnight bag. The morning light caught the hollow spaces beneath her eyes, but there was something different about her posture. Straighter, more deliberate, like she'd shed an invisible weight I hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. "Can I come home?" she asked, her voice steady despite the vulnerability in the question. I opened my arms without hesitation, and for the first time in months, my daughter's embrace felt genuine. No performance, no desperate attempt to convince herself she was happy. Just Emma returning to herself. Over the following days, I watched her navigate the quiet spaces of our house with a grace I hadn't seen since before Daniel entered her life. She would sit in the garden with her morning coffee, reading books she'd abandoned during their relationship. She cooked elaborate meals for just the two of us, humming softly while she worked, a habit Daniel had criticized as too distracting. The transformation wasn't immediate or dramatic. It was subtle, like watching a flower unfold in slow motion. She laughed more freely, but the laughter was quieter, more genuine. Her smiles became smaller but somehow more radiant, reaching her eyes in a way they hadn't for months. One evening, about 2 weeks after her return, Emma made dinner. Her grandmother's recipe for coco vin, the one that required hours of patient preparation. We ate by candlelight in the dining room, using the good china, sharing comfortable silences between bites. "Thank you," she said suddenly, setting down her wine glass with deliberate care. I waited, knowing she needed space to find her words. "I know you knew," she continued, her eyes meeting mine across the table. "Maybe not everything, but enough. And I know you could have stopped it earlier, but you didn't. You let me have my wedding day even knowing." She trailed off, but her expression held no anger, only a deep, complicated gratitude that didn't require explanation. "You deserve to make your own choice," I replied simply. "Even if that choice was discovering the truth for yourself." We finished dinner without mentioning Daniel's name once, and somehow that silence felt more healing than any conversation could have been. Zach's return happened gradually, like sunrise after a long night. Emma had been home for almost a month when she finally asked the question I'd been waiting for. "Where is he really?" "Zach, I know he wasn't traveling for work." We were sitting on the terrace, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and rose. Emma's voice held curiosity rather than accusation, as if she were solving a puzzle rather than confronting a deception. "Why don't you call him and ask?" I suggested gently. She pulled out her phone and dialed his number. I could hear it ringing through the speaker, then Zach's familiar voice answering with cautious warmth. "Hey Em. Where are you?" she asked without preamble. "About 15 minutes away," he replied, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "Been staying at the Marriott downtown. Waiting for you to be ready to see me." The tears came then, not the broken sobs of heartbreak, but the cleansing rain of relief and recognition. Zach arrived 20 minutes later, And Emma launched herself into his arms like she had when they were children and he'd returned from summer camp. "Not far," he said when she asked again where he'd been. "Just quiet." They held each other in the foyer for a long time, and when they finally separated, something in our family constellation had realigned itself. The empty space that Daniel had tried to fill was revealed for what it truly was. Not a void that needed filling but a protective buffer that had kept us safe. The package from Lila arrived on a Thursday morning, wrapped in brown paper with no return address. Inside, nestled in tissue paper like a sacred relic, was the engagement ring Daniel had originally purchased for her. The one Zach had found documentation for during his investigation. It was beautiful in a conventional way. A classic solitaire setting with a diamond that caught the light predictably. But holding it, I felt only sadness for the woman who'd been manipulated just as thoroughly as my daughter, though in different ways. There was no note, no explanation, just the quiet gesture of a woman returning something that had never truly belonged to her. Emma examined the ring with detached curiosity, like an archaeologist studying an artifact from a civilization she'd never known. "She loved him too," Emma said quietly, turning the ring in the morning light. "Or thought she did." "Yes," I agreed. "You both deserved better." Emma placed the ring back in its box with gentle finality. "What should we do with it?" "Whatever feels right to you." She was quiet for a moment, then smiled. One of those new, smaller smiles that held more truth than her old theatrical ones. "I think I'll donate it. Let it become someone else's beginning instead of our ending." The society pages and gossip networks had a field day with the story, though they never learned the full truth. The official narrative was simply that the marriage had been annulled due to irreconcilable differences discovered immediately after the ceremony. But those who'd been at the wedding remembered the empty chair, and gradually, the real story emerged in whispered conversations at country clubs and charity galas. "Remember the missing brother at the Wellington wedding?" I overheard Mrs. Henderson saying at the club's spring luncheon. "Turns out he saved the whole family from disaster." The conversations were always respectful, tinged with admiration rather than scandal. People began to understand that Zach's absence had been strategic, protective, even heroic. When they saw me now, there were subtle nods of acknowledgement, as if they recognized that I'd seen something they'd missed. The baccarat crystal flute that Daniel had toasted with that night found its way to a place of honor in my china cabinet. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder that sometimes the most precious things survive intact despite being handled by unworthy hands. These days I keep that chair by the window in my study, positioned where the afternoon light falls across its empty seat. It's become my favorite piece of furniture not despite its emptiness but because of it. Every morning I dust it carefully, polish the wood until it gleams, and appreciate the space it occupies without demanding to be filled. Sometimes when the light hits it just right I can almost see Zach sitting there during those months of careful watching and patient planning. Other times I see all the other meaningful absences in my life. My husband's chair at the dinner table, the space where Emma's childhood bedroom used to echo with laughter, the moments when saying nothing meant everything. The chair has taught me that absence isn't always loss. Sometimes it's protection. Sometimes it's strategy. Sometimes it's the deepest form of love, stepping back so others can learn to stand on their own, creating space for truth to emerge naturally rather than forcing revelations that might cause more harm than healing. Emma visits that chair sometimes, running her fingers along its wooden arms with the same reverence she once reserved for prayer. She understands now what it represents, not abandonment but vigilance. Not distance, but the perfect positioning to catch someone when they're ready to fall into their own wisdom. Zach. He sits in it occasionally when he visits, usually when he's helping me plan some new family protection strategy or reviewing investment portfolios. The chair seems to fit him perfectly, as if it had been waiting all along for someone who understood that the most powerful position isn't always center stage. The empty chair has become our family's most treasured heirloom, not because of what it holds but because of what it protects. In its deliberate absence we found our way back to each other. If this story of a mother's strategic protection had you captivated, hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when the empty chair's true meaning was finally revealed, showing how absence became the ultimate act of love. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more powerful family stories like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.